good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I don't know where in the world you are, but I want to welcome you to the No Job Podcast. My name is Najee Simmons, your host. And here we believe that everybody has to earn a living, but nobody has to have a job because all a job is trading your time for money. Life is about a lot more than that. Work is using your passion, using your energy to contribute or build something that's important to you. And we believe you can make money doing that. And I've built this podcast to help you. This community is gathered to help everyone who thinks the way that we do. Today, I have a special guest. His name is Ivan Farber. I consider him a conversation expert. Why did I ask a conversation expert to come on the show? Because conversing is communication. And if you're ever going to market and sell your product or your service to the people in the world, you have to communicate it really well. You have to make them understand what it is you have to offer. And on the flip side of the coin, and Ivan's really big on this, you have to be able to listen. I think some of the most successful people in business are the ones who fine tune their ear to hear what the customer needs, what the customer wants in a way that the competition just isn't sensing. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome host of his own podcast, Conversations About Conversations, and author of a great book he's going to tell us about too, Ivan Farber. Ivan, how's it going? Welcome.
Najee, thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
I appreciate you taking the time out to do this. You're in sunny California, right?
No, I'm in the rainy Northwest.
Oh, I thought you were in CA. Okay, I'm glad to make that clarification. Doesn't make a big difference for us though. So, Ivan, I first became aware of you when a friend of the show, David DeSell, he's been a guest on the show, a friend of mine from business, had you on his podcast. And I hadn't really heard of a conversation expert before. Can you tell us how it dawned on you to be a conversation expert or even a student of conversations? Tell us what you call yourself and how you arrived there.
Well, I call myself Chief Conversations Officer, but just because it's fun. I'm a 27-year veteran of the financial services industry. And so essentially all I've done my whole career is have conversations. That's it. And I've been successful at relationship management, building businesses, bringing in business, all of that. And all you have for your craft is conversations. I wanted to write a book to pay it forward. So about 4 years ago, I set on writing a book. The first 100 days of writing the book, all I did was just creative writing, like stream of consciousness. And at the end of 100 days, I had, I think, 2 books. One book was what I called Your Manager is Not Your Manager. The person sitting in your chair is. And the other one was something about conversations. And I was talking with a friend of mine at the water cooler, and he said, lots of people have written books about self-management, but nobody's really written a book about conversations. That's your destiny, your book to write. So I wrote the book, finished it in 2018. And since then, I've been building classes, courses, doing a lot of coaching on conversations.
Awesome. It's super, super nichey. That's one thing I really like about it. Yeah, that's a word I like to use, nichey. Have never encountered it before. And, people have written about communication before, even, but conversations, I feel, is really narrowing it down to a very fine level. And I think it's the hope of a lot of people here to really crystallize what it is they do because everybody, like, for example, me, right? And maybe you can help me work through this. I've always been an encouraging person, very motivational. So my first inclination was to think maybe I can be a motivational speaker. And I think I still am in some sense. However, I've really narrowed it down to motivating to do what? Motivating you to make a living doing what you love. And that's where the No Job podcast was born. For me, trying to be as true to myself and as nichey as possible. So let me tell you, what is your journey? How has your journey surprised you so far, sort of building this brand and deepening your knowledge base about conversations?
Well, before I answer that, let me say that you are motivational. Like I have you in my ears when I'm going for a walk, even a bike ride, and you are motivating me, giving me hope to have my own no job,
Awesome,
right?
man.
Like, I love when you say things like, I love to work, but I don't like a job.
Right.
And that. So, okay. So, what surprised me? I think what continually surprises me is actually how little importance people give to the very unit of relationships, and that is our conversations. Like, people spend a lot of time learning to write, and they put a lot into emails. In fact, right, people put more sometimes into writing an email than they do into preparing for a conversation. So actually, yeah, I love the word niche, uh, but I don't think people put enough time into really preparing themselves to have great conversations. And then when you don't have great conversations, you don't have great relationships.
Right. That was pretty cool. That was here's what I liked about what you just said. You called conversation the units of relationships, and I've never heard it quite termed that way. The picture that came to my mind, the sort of word picture, was conversations being to relationships what bricks are to a building. So that's pretty cool because any relationship you have is the sum total of your conversations and your communication with that other person or with that other party. And tell me, what are your thoughts on entrepreneurs, right? Communicating with the market, quote unquote, en masse, communicating with people. Do you focus more on person to person conversations? And even if you do, can you tell us what you think people who are trying to communicate their message and services to the world should be mindful of when they want to communicate?
Wow, that's a multifaceted question that you've asked. All right, can I unpack that a little bit?
100%, and take your time.
Okay. So you had an element about entrepreneurs and how to communicate your message. And then you had an element about one on one communication. And also, there was another part of that.
I don't even remember, Ivan.
Okay.
I'm just firing on all cylinders. So
You are, man.
what you
You
remember?
are. Okay. So let me say that I have a job right now. I'm come clean, right?
Me too.
Yeah. And so it's such a great concept, the No Job podcast. And I've always been what I refer to as an intra corporate entrepreneur, right? Like, yeah, I am a W-2 employee, but if I could think of myself more as a 1099 employee, then I have a little bit of that free agent mentality. And there was a point in time where I was an entrepreneur. I spent 3 years in my 27-year career. I spent 3 full years being an entrepreneur, and the reason I went back to full-time employment was because I wasn't niche enough. I did not have a specialty, and so it actually was 2003, 4, and 5 that I was self-employed, and now the last 16 years has kind of allowed my thinking to age like a wine, like a fine wine, and then come back with, yeah, there is a niche here. Okay, so to entrepreneurs, I mean, nothing happens until a sale is made. How do you make a sale? A conversation.
Mhm.
Najee, my approach is needs based. So the model that I write about in my book and that I coach to is all about a mutual understanding of your prospects or your clients or your colleagues' needs.
Right. So I guess in order to know those needs, you have to listen, which is the other piece of conversing. You know, I I told you before the cameras went on that I was at a wedding last night, and one of my friends confided in me that he gets a little nervous at events like this because he doesn't think he converses very well. And I said, "Well, I just saw you talking to this young lady, and it seemed like it was going pretty well." And he said, "Well, she was doing all the talking." And I thought, "Well, why would you want it any other way? Shouldn't it be about getting the other person talking? Then you can relax. Then you can just listen." So, can you tell me about listening? Because in listening to your podcast, I know that's a word that comes up for you a lot in an area where a lot of people may fall short of um, the mark.
There are so many ways you can listen. The first thing, though, in listening is you have to be willing to not interrupt other people and willing to be silent. And that's something that I read once that sticks with a lot of people, is that the letters in the word listen and the letters in the word silent are the same letters. I think that you gave your friend really good advice, that a conversation is more than talking. In fact, you could say that the time that you really are connecting with someone else and understanding their needs is when you're listening.
Hmm.
So I often recommend that people go into a conversation with an intention for how they're going to listen. So
Okay.
it could be you're going in, you're listening with an intention to understand the thinking. It could be more that you're listening for the feelings, or it could be more that you want to listen to how to collaborate with this person.
Hmm. That's smart. You talked about prep. So you're talking about preparation essentially, and how many of us fail to mentally prepare for what we want to get out of a conversation. We don't even know what we would want to get out of that conversation. So how then can we prepare? That's pretty cool. So can you tell me those categories again of what you plan to listen for in the conversation? Can you run those by me again?
Sure. Well, listen for thoughts, listen for feelings, listen to collaborate, listen for potential next steps, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So, bef- would you say you had a knack for conversations? Did you sort of naturally grasp some of this stuff, and you did some reading and do research to fine tune it, or did you delve into this study out of a deficit of conversation skills, for lack of a better phrase?
Yeah, I was really bad at it, and thought I was really good at it. And
Hmm.
I had the benefit of a mentor in my 20s who realized that she couldn't tell me directly that I was bad at it. So she sent me to take the Dale Carnegie course, where I learned pretty quickly that I was not really being very sensitive in my communications. And then in my 30s, I had a mentor who was very strict with me, very disciplined. He was a retired military officer. And he taught me the science element of it. And it was really at that point in time that I started experimenting with all sorts of different strategies. So I've been lucky to have someone who really helped me focus on the art of conversation, but also someone who helped me focus on the science of conversation. And when I say science of conversation, it's very predictable, certain sequences that you'll get a certain result.
Okay.
Very predictable.
Hmm.
And the place that I always start with people is being intentional about the use of open-ended questions versus closed-ended questions, because they get very different results predictably time after time after time.
Okay. So tell me, can you go a little bit more into that open versus closed-ended conversations or questions rather?
Yeah, absolutely. So the difference, right, when you think definitionally speaking, an open-ended question is a question that starts with who, what, when, where, why, and how. So I always often say it's the journalist questions. Then a closed-ended question starts with did you, are you, do you, have you, could you, would you, should you. It's kind of like in the book Green Eggs and Ham, Sam I Am is being asked, do you like him in a box? Do you like him with a fox? Here, there, anywhere. The problem is that when you're trying to open up a conversation and really understand someone's needs, you need to ask open-ended questions. And when you want to confirm information or nail things down, you ask closed-ended questions. But you will see, if you really start paying attention, that there's a virtual uh, I shouldn't use it, but pre-pandemic, I used this, so I'm going to keep using it. There's a virtual pandemic in the use of closed-ended questions.
Hmm.
And as a result, people close things down.
Hmm. Hmm. So you mean they close the person they're speaking to off? they're closing access to what that person really thinks and feels off. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. Use the wedding again. Is if I said, "Did you like the wedding?
Yes.
How was the wedding?
It was good.
What was good about it?"
Got to see my friends that I haven't seen in a long time. It was nice to reunite with them and their families too.
Right. That's a really different answer, right? Than just yes.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Perfect example. It makes sense. So I don't know if you get into this in your conversations about conversations, but as part of the No Job podcast, a big element is being true to yourself, right? We're trying to figure out how to make a living doing what we want, being true to ourselves, not only doing what we want, but in the way that we want to do it. Do you find people have trouble communicating because they're trying to communicate as who they think they're supposed to be or someone besides themselves?
I do. I do. Authenticity is, we know when people are not being authentic,
Hmm.
and you got to be you.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that's central to what a lot of people listening want to do. They feel like they're forced to live as someone else in the roles that they're in now, which is a big part of why they're seeking the freedom of having no job. Can you talk about any instances you are aware of, or maybe have coached someone through, of helping them redirect the way they converse to match up with who they are in a more authentic way?
Yeah, it happened yesterday. I had a potential client who I realized right away I wasn't actually a good fit for, but a potential client who is really living inauthentically. He said, "There's a lack of mistrust at the upper management with me. And as a result, I've been kind of disengaging, and it's making an impact on my customers, my colleagues, like everybody, and then it's eroding his self-esteem." And I said, "Well, let's be authentic about that. You are not doing your best, are you?" He said, "You're right, I'm not." I said, "Well, doing less than your best erodes your self-esteem. So that you're getting what you're creating in that conversation." He said, "Yeah, but the management team, the president, just makes me feel really inferior." And it reminded me of what Eleanor Roosevelt said, which is, "No one can make you feel inferior without your permission." So I just met him, and it was just one of those initial conversations, but I basically gave him a kick in the behind. I said, "Start doing your best. What are you doing?
Hmm.
Like, okay, if you need a new job, great. But while you're there," which reminds me always of the Martin Luther King quote of, "If a man is a street sweeper, let him sweep the streets as best as he can." Like, that's the pride in your work. And I love how you distinguish between your work and your job,
Hmm.
because they are different. And very few people, Najee, do. In fact, I love how you do it. It's still a little bit of a foreign concept for me. So like every time I hear you kind of explain it, it gets deeper in me, that I'm
Hmm.
like, okay, yeah, Najee loves to work, but he hates jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And as you stated, even if someone hates his job, it's not an excuse to work as hard as you to not work as hard as you can and do your very best at it, because you never do know what it'll lead to. The bottom line is most opportunities people get in life come through other people, and you never know who's around you. You never know who's in your company. You never know who's watching, and you never know what people they know. So I definitely appreciate that piece of wisdom. Where do you feel where do you feel the lack of communication and things like the closed-ended question pandemic? Where do you think that's having the most negative effect? Where do you think it's showing up the most in our lives today?
well, we don't ever really truly understand other people's needs, wants, and how we can best collaborate with them.
Hmm.
Let me give you, if I may, a little more context on my conversation model.
100.
And there's 100. So there's really two elements to it. My book has 10 chapters. The first 5 chapters are really about the art of conversation, and the second 5 are really more about the science of conversation and structure of conversations. In terms of the art, I feel there's always and everywhere a need for rapport. always a need for using questions skillfully, listening, exercising self-control, and satisfying needs. So to put that in an acronym so that everybody can remember that, the acronym is RULES: rapport, using questions skillfully, listening, exercising the self-control to listen and use your questions skillfully, and then satisfy needs. So that's the first 5 chapters. The second half of the book is a model that I call CLEAR, and it stands for create, learn, explore, address, and resolve. So the art part is kind of always there, and then the structure of a conversation really creates something very, very different than just your average conversation.
Right. I understand. I think one of the main takeaways that I'm getting out of this conversation is that conversations are something that you can prepare for. I think because in life we're forced to have them so often, and that's just the way that we communicate in this world, they become so common to us that we don't put any thought into them. When in fact, because they're so common, we should be putting a lot of thought into them because we do them more than we converse more than we do almost anything else. And I really appreciate you coming on the show, and I appreciate that you identify with the mission and the heart of the No Job podcast. And I'm of course wishing you the very best on your path to no job. I'm just curious, ideally, how does that work out for you? Are you looking forward to a future where you do speaking engagements? I know you mentioned some courses you have already. Can you tell me a little bit about the world, according to Ivan Farber, when everything's rolling?
So it's a perfect question, and I just created my vision, my 25-year vision. So this is perfect timing for this conversation. I wanted to create a course, and I've always been inspired by the Dale Carnegie course. I mentioned that earlier, and what Dale Carnegie brought. But what Dale Carnegie brought and his principles are timeless and they're excellent, but they're very macro. And what I couldn't find anywhere, didn't see, was something at the micro unit of a conversation. So there's all sorts of stuff about relationships, but not like, okay, what's the brass tacks here? How do I do this conversation alone? But I wasn't completely inspired by just creating a course. It wasn't big enough.
Mhm.
So I was in the elevator 2 weeks ago, and it hit me. There needs to be a conversations university,
Mm,
like Conversations University, where you could get a bachelor's of conversations or a master's. Imagine you were a master of conversations.
right.
So that's what I created, like a 25-year future, because it's going to be a big undertaking to create a university. But Najee, whenever you create that vision of your future that you live into, it impacts you right away. And so now I'm looking at everything through the lens of, well, I'm a university. I'm the possibility of a university of conversations.
Mhm.
And my vision is it's a full business school, that it's a full business school, but you major in conversations. So it's gotten me pretty excited lately.
Yeah, I think it's all about what can get you excited and what can inspire you. And I appreciate your audacity. And I usually hear that, in a negative way. You're seeking to do something similar to what Dale Carnegie did when he was alive. And the temptation for most people, I don't even know if you deal with this, is to think, who am I to try to do what Dale Carnegie did? I don't have access to the people he had access to. I don't have his skills, his gifts. What was the conversation like with yourself? What is the conversation with you like when you have these big dreams and there's the temptation for these negative thoughts to creep in?
Oh, Najee, I'm terrified by it, by the way. I'm just terrified by it.
Okay.
And it's just, I mean, that's just authentic, right? Like it's scary, but what is scarier is playing small. Like that should be much scarier for people. It's much more comfortable to play small. And what I had to be responsible for was that I've been playing really small. So um, I've had the same job for 14 years. I like the job. I like the work. Maybe I could say, in your definition, I like the work more than I like the job. right? I like it better when I think about, I'm a relationship manager. And so I manage relationships in financial services for about 130 families. And I love the families and I love the work inside of every conversation. I love what we create. Even clients that I've had for 14 years, we create a depth of understanding that goes deeper each time. It's always going deeper. It's always growing. So I like the work. And then of course there's things that companies do that just don't feel good. And you got to focus on the work. But I'm scared by it. Um, I have this outside business, so it's very disclosed with the company. You're doing this business. We know it's your outside activity. We know you're spending X number of hours on it. But even though I've had this activity on file, I haven't really played full out. And so it was the bold declaration of, all right, let's create a university. All of a sudden started impacting me today.
Hmm. Sure, absolutely. And speaking of dreaming big and letting it impact you, I think all the conversation techniques and ideas we've talked about today, we can use on ourselves. As you know from the podcast, a big point I make is changing the way that you talk to yourself and changing the way that you think. And as we were talking, I realized, I don't often ask myself open-ended questions, right? And even when I ask closed-ended questions that should lead to an open-ended question, it never happens. Like, how did you feel about your performance in this meeting? I feel good. If I take the extra step to find out why I felt good and what was so good about it, maybe I could focus on those things and multiply the good feelings and multiply the good vibes. I do you think people listen to themselves? You mentioned people not listening to others. Do you think people really listen to themselves? Do they take the time to do that? And what would happen for them if they did?
So you asked that as a closed-ended question.
Ah.
And every time someone asks me a closed-ended question, usually what I'm listening for is what's the statement in that question.
Hmm.
And because I've listened to the podcast, I'm a loyal listener. I hear your point of view, right? Like your point of view is that people both listen to themselves but also don't listen to themselves. Is that kind of what you're stating?
Yes, I would say so. Yes.
Yeah. And I mean I literally just listened to the season 2 first one on objections, and you're so spot on with your observations in that episode. Just you nailed it.
Thank you, man. I appreciate it. I appreciate it very much. And as we get ready to close this conversation, I would just like you to shout out your social media, tell people where they can find you, the name of the book, and where they can find it, and anything else, really, anything else that you'd like to say to people who want to improve in conversations, want to improve their communication, and somehow use their skills to make a living doing what they love.
Thanks for the opportunity. All right. Well, I think the podcast that I have is a great place to start. It's called Conversations About Conversations. It's on Apple and Google and Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Amazon. So you can find it everywhere. You can go to my website, conversations.biz, B-I-Z, because I'm all about the biz. And if you go to conversations.biz/podcast, you can find a link to all of the different podcast registries, YouTube channel as well. And on conversations.biz homepage, there's a link right to the book to purchase it on Amazon. It's available paperback, Kindle, and then most recently, and thanks to David DeSell, our mutual friend, there's an audio version because David insisted that in fact, he came on my podcast and made a challenge. He said, Ivan, in 3 months, I'm going to challenge you to have your book as an audio. And it was not easy, but like a lot of things worth doing, it's not easy. I'm on LinkedIn is a big place that I play, and Twitter. So people can follow me there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ivan, so much for taking the time out of your day to talk to the audience and the community here at the No Job Podcast. We appreciate you, and you're somebody because I think we're so well aligned. We're gonna have back in the future, and I look forward to that meeting. Have an awesome day, man.
Thank you, Najee.